Hello everybody. I'm sorry I can't be with you this week, but I'm excited to talk to you about Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which is one of my favourite poems. I like doing this week on scary stuff in the first year course because it's a course on an introduction to language and literature, but selfishly I want some of the smart, fun, articulate, capable people in this room to major in English, so me or people like me get the chance to teach you in the future. So this is also a nakedly ideological project in that I want some of you to study English. And even if you don't, hopefully this will speak to some of the value of the discipline, and it'll also hopefully be fun for you because we all like to watch or experience scary or unsettling things. So today we're doing the poem. On Wednesday we're going to do Freud's essay on the uncanny, which I'm not going to ask you to read. You can read it beforehand if you want. It's for free on the internet. But I'm just going to talk about some of the most salient points from that essay that will help us look again at The Raven, and it will also help us anticipate the viewing of Blink, the Doctor Who episode on Friday, which does a lot of cool things with what Freud talks about vis-a-vis what is uncanny, what is unsettling. So let's start with Poe's The Raven. One of the reasons this is a favourite of mine is because the famously pretentious American poet T.S. Eliot, who wrote The Wasteland and the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, hated this poem. He thought it was too splashy and over the top. But I quite like splashy and over the top, so let's do it and let's stick it to Eliot. Just to be clear, I really like T.S. Eliot's poetry, but he was a pretentious asshole. So, The Raven is not a jump scare poem. It's kind of difficult to imagine a poem being about jump scares. The Raven is an uncanny, unsettling poem. And as we'll see with Freud, the next lecture, one of the things about the uncanny is we get unsettled when familiar things work in an out-of-place way. So Freud uses the example of waxworks. Waxworks are scary because they look like living things but are inanimate. And the more lifelike the waxwork looks, the more uncanny and unsettling it is because it looks like it could move but it doesn't. Similarly, things like, shop window clothes dummies or something, if they move, as they do in lots of horror movies and such, that's unsettling because it's something that looks fairly lifelike, but not lifelike enough to actually move. So that when it does move, it's acting out of its space. It's not being a shop window dummy anymore, it's moving. Like the definition of a shop window dummy is that it's static. So in The Raven, it's the bird becoming some kind of prophet in the mind of the speaker that is uncanny. Like we all know that ravens are very smart and that they can pick up simple words. So intrinsically that's all the raven does in this poem, is the raven comes in to the guy's room and says one word, nevermore, repeatedly. But the way in which it appears to the speaker to be prophesying his fate and the fate of his lost loved one is highly unsettling because the bird shouldn't be able to do that. What's almost as uncanny, and maybe more so depending on what you think, is it's the way that the raven speaks itself that's uncanny, in the sense that ravens are birds. In our minds they shouldn't be able to speak. So Edgar Allan Poe is very intelligently tapping in to something that actually exists. That he doesn't need to make it up in the poem. He doesn't need to make up the raven becoming a prophet. Ravens do speak in real life, and they're probably not speaking in the way that we associate speech as like a form of communication. They're mimicking, but they can mimic so well right down to the sort of timbre of the voice of the person they're listening to. They can mimic so well that it sounds like they're communicating, and that in and of itself is uncanny. So Poe has written a story about an uncanny thing in real life, ravens, apparently speaking, and he's written that speaking raven into the poem, producing something also uncanny, the prophet. The final thing that's uncanny about the poem is the speaker himself, who descends into madness and possibly death, although we don't know that for sure, so probably don't say that he dies. Madness is also uncanny, right? I mean, the term madness is potentially problematic because it's frequently historically been used to refer to people with mental health challenges, so be a little careful with terms like madness and craziness. But madness is also a sort of widely used cultural trope, so I think it's okay to talk about it here. Madness is uncanny because we identify ourselves as in-control, rational beings, and if we lose that, then we are acting out of our space, right? Human beings are supposed to be rational and in control and conscious entities, and if we lose those things, we look like a human being, but we might not be anymore. And that's potentially what happens to our speaker, and that too is uncanny. It's scary. So hopefully you're getting the sense that things acting in a way that they shouldn't is a key part of this poem, and repetition is a key part of this poem too, because as Freud says in the essay, and we'll talk about this on Wednesday, repetition itself can be uncanny, and I'll explain why later. So there are a lot of stanzas to this poem, but let's start at where I like to begin, the start. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. So it's midnight. Midnight is a spooky time. And our speaker is weak and weary. And when we're tired and exhausted and sort of weighed down, our defenses are down. I'm sure we've all experienced this. If you're going to be scared, you're probably not going to be scared of something when you're bright and fresh first thing in the morning, you're full of energy and zeal, and it's light out. You're going to be scared when it's late at night, when you're tired, when you're feeling a bit anxious already. So that's the state our speaker is in. He's also been pondering over many volumes of forgotten lore. So this is also an example of the uncanny, because as human beings, as Freud says, we like to think that we're in control and that we understand how the world works. So ghost stories are always scary because they get to the heart of this notion that we know we don't understand everything about the world, and from a scientific perspective, if you don't understand something, don't make claims about it, right? But from a kind of unconscious perspective, we always like to think the worst, or not always, but when we're feeling vulnerable, we think the worst. So a creak on a stair in our house when we're there alone, when we're feeling good, it's just a creak on the stair, but when we're tired, it can be someone's in the house. Pondering over these quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore is a way for the speaker to, or for the poet I should say, for Poe to give us this sense of lost or forbidden knowledge, right? That there are curious and unknown ways the world works, which we try to forget about in our everyday lives, but our speaker is fully invested in these things. So the poem starts out with the speaker potentially in a vulnerable state, a spooky time, midnight, while also potentially being fascinated by hidden knowledge. And the other thing we know about being fascinated by hidden knowledge, of course, is that you shouldn't do it. Don't open the book about raising the dead in case you accidentally raise the dead. Line 3. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. So our speaker is nearly napping, and that gives us the sense of him inhabiting this kind of interstitial space, halfway between awake and asleep. Sleep is obviously also frequently used as a metaphor for death, the sleep of death. So the speaker is also potentially kind of knocking on the netherworld, or at least other worlds, the other worlds of sleep, of dreams, of death. So reality is becoming more porous here, which again is frequently scary. We want reality to be stable and predictable, right? We don't want ghosts and goblins to start, or demons to start coming in out of thin air. And he hears a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. The repetition of rapping here is key. Obviously, it goes through the poem, pretty much all the way through, or at least the echoes of it do. And that repetition draws attention to the word. And someone rapping at your door is not scary. Repeating the term rapping, however, draws attention to it without telling us why. And a visitor at midnight is not the same as a visitor at midday. A visitor at midday is probably going to be someone giving you flyers about pizza, but a visitor at midnight could be anything. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." So obviously the phrase "only this and nothing more" in fact suggests that the speaker is worried it might be something more. That's the kind of thing, and in its direct speech here, this isn't the poem telling us the story, it's in quotation marks. So this is the speaker, not just speaking to us through the poem, but speaking in the poem, speaking out loud. We speak like this when we're trying to reassure ourselves, right? He's trying to reassure himself that it's only a visitor, nothing more. That immediately foreshadows the likelihood that it is going to be more, and that primes us for something scary. So it's very effective. The second stanza, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. And this is the kind of thing that T.S. Eliot complained about being over the top, but I just love it. It's amazing. Remember the function of alliteration, the repeated consonant sounds, that it tells us which words are most important for the line. So, distinctly, I remember it was in the bleak December. So, distinctly December. That means the cold month of December is extremely important. And December has a lot of connotations to it, and we're told what connotations by the word bleak. So bleak December. It's cold, it's quiet, there aren't many people out and about. And this guy's alone in his chambers as well, and we're about to find out he's lost his loved one. So Christmas is awesome if you've got a family, or sometimes awesome. But if you're alone, it's awful because it accentuates that you're alone, right? And the distinctness of this memory, distinctly, it was in the bleak December. The poem draws attention to the word distinctly because it, again, foreshadows that something very distinct is going to happen in this poem, that this is a unique event. And then one of my favourite lines in the poem, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. This is a line of genius because even though it's a slightly archaic phrase, talking about dying embers or the fire dying down is still something we use today, whether it's in Britain or Canada. So there's nothing intrinsically sinister about the phrase dying ember, but the way in which it's articulated in this line is extremely sinister. For a start, the dying ember is separate. So remember, there's that true but uncomfortable phrase, we live together but we die alone. So the dying ember is separate, articulates this idea that we die alone. And the dying ember, while it's dying, isn't passive, it's active. It has wrought its ghost upon the floor. So that just means that it's throwing its shadow. But Poe uses this figurative phrase, wrought its ghost upon the floor. So the dying ember is active, it's doing something, it's producing this ghost. Which again it's foreshadowing the scariness of the other world intruding on our day-to-day life, right? Instead of saying its shadow wrought its ghost. So the poem is articulating the potential presence of otherworldliness, and the ghost falling on the floor foreshadows the end of the poem, where our hero, in catatonic terror, collapses unmoving on the floor, just like the ghost of the dying ember. So there's this beautiful foreshadowing ellipsis that Poe is generating here. And here we find out about sorrow for the lost Lenore, the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. So the angels have named her Lenore, partially because she's so angelic, potentially, but also probably because she's dead. Nameless here in the mortal realm forevermore. And then in the third stanza, the poem explicitly thematizes repetition. It turns repetition into a theme. So in line 15, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, to some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more. So the repetition of and nothing more again continues to build and emphasizes that there is something more happening here. And the poem, by using the term I stood repeating, thematizes, explicitly turns the literary technique of repetition into a theme of the poem itself. The poem is explicitly playing with repetition. And then the line itself, line 16 being repeated, to some visitor entreating entrance, some late visitor entreating entrance. This is intrinsically terrible writing. Repetition of words is easy to overuse, and great writers are hopefully going to be developing sophisticated enough linguistics that they can not repeat words because they've got alternate words for the same idea. So repeating entire phrases you really shouldn't do. So it means you can do it, right? It means you can occasionally do it if there's a purpose. And look at the purpose here. The entire line, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door," is identical from line 16 to 17 except for two words. "'Tis some" changes to "some late." Some late visitor. And late has a doubled meaning, right? Late can mean you're late for class, but late can also mean